So good evening, everyone. Welcome to the third in our May series of expert talks, talks online about data. This is the final one in the May series. I'm going to spend some time this evening talking about some of the principles, practices, and pitfalls of data pipelines, which is a good illustration from our recent playbook. After which we've got a brilliant panel who you can see there, who will talk about their own experiences and answer some of the questions I'm sure you have. So let's start at why we care about pipelines. Why are we interested in them in the first place? Well, most businesses have lots of data that they want to use to understand their customers better or to gain insights into their operations, know better how they're working and how they can improve. They want to know what sorts of customers they have, what the customers like to buy, or how better to assess risk or to fulfill orders. Lots and lots of things they want to do. And usually this data is kept in a variety of operational systems. And to get that additional insight, that additional business value out of it, it needs to be transported to a place where it can be easily analyzed. We like to think of this transportation as a pipeline for a variety of reasons, because data goes in at one end, so it comes from source data and it goes through and it comes out at another end, a place where it can be analyzed. The data won't get there by itself. So if you don't lay that pipe, the data will just stay in the puddles around the business. So it will probably just sit there. The volume and the speed at which that data gets to the people who want to analyze it are limited by the type of the pipe you're using. So you can have a really big pipe that takes lots of data and you'll get there in volumes and very, very quickly, or you might have a very thin pipe and the data gets there quite slowly or only a small amount of it. And the other, I think, reason why this metaphor works well for me is that pipes can leak. If you don't take care of your pipes, if you don't watch them, if you don't see what's happening, you can lose the data if you're not paying attention. So, when we talk about a pipeline, what do we mean? Well, we usually mean something like this. On the left-hand side here, we have source data. So the stuff from the operational systems, that might be a CRM system, or transactional systems, website behaviors, systems from other partners, all sorts of things. And we want to make it available to the people who want to use it. And that's the people here on the right-hand side. So that can be here, business intelligence type people, so the people who make dashboards and reports about important metrics, or the data scientists, who are creating algorithms or performing in-depth ad hoc analyses. And when I talk about data scientists, I mean them in the broadest sense. So, including things like risk analysts, quants, web behavior analysts, and so on. Anybody really who needs a historical source of data to mine for patterns or insights. So the data comes in at the left-hand side here. It gets ingested from these source systems into some kind of landing zone. That might be file storage. It might be a stream, it might be SQL tables, and it gets transformed in a variety of ways, cleansed, probably conformed into some kind of a common schema, and stored in a place that is easy to use by these people here. But what can go wrong? What are the pitfalls? Probably if you're here, you've already experienced some of these. Probably you may know others. But let's say you know that your data is valuable. You've been collecting it, but somehow you find that you're still not gaining the value from it that you were hoping. You still can't exploit it in the way you want. So maybe you have problems with access. So perhaps your pipelines aren't built properly or in the wrong or not built at all, and the data is scattered about your organization, still in those puddles perhaps, and the people who need it can't get hold of it. Or it could be that the data is collected, but the right people don't have the permissions to use it. So it's collected, but they don't have the access because of some kind of security constraint. You might have problems with trust. So the data that is coming in is untrusted. Maybe you've created a pipeline or a data store, but no one trusts what's in it. It's often wrong or it's flaky. And so everyone ends up creating their own versions of the truth using spreadsheets and individual manual processes. Maybe you can't use it. Maybe the data users can't use it. So although it is technically available to them, in fact, it's the wrong data, or it's in the wrong format, or it's difficult to understand, so nobody bothers using it because they don't know what's in there. or maybe it's some of the data, but it's not enough to be useful. Could be it takes too long. And it could take too long in the sense that, the first sense, which is that the useful life of your data is not the same as the time it takes to get in. So maybe the useful life of your data is in the next hour, but you only have access to the data that is a day old, in which case it's no longer useful for you. Or it could take too long in the sense that you regularly need to have new data sources added, but every time you want to add a new data source, it just takes too long to get it into place. It can take months to get it into place. So what can you do to reduce the chances of these pitfalls happening? How can you make sure the data flows to the right people in the right time frame in a way that works for them and can be trusted? So I'm going to talk about some principles and practices that we've found to be helpful in avoiding these problems. Everything in here is from our playbook, and everything in our playbook has come from our experiences, things that we've experienced, we've seen, or we've experienced in clients, all sorts of things. So it's all real world stuff, this. I hope it's useful. First principle. So I think the first thing to say is that the data environment is always dynamic. So your sources change and the needs of the end user changes. So, and things can happen. So new fields can get added, they can be renamed subtly. The sorts of things that go into fields can change. Maybe you suddenly have a $ put in something or not. Passwords can change, all sorts of things can happen. So you'll always need to be adaptive to the data in your organization. If you treat your pipelines as a project that is completed and then finished, and then you can walk away, you won't be able to respond to those changes and your pipelines will get out of date. So you really do need to adopt a product mindset. Your data pipelines are products, and you need to recognize that that means that there's a level of support that's required and that they have a product owner. So somebody who cares about the health of the pipelines. Ideally, somebody who has a stake in it working correctly. Like any product, you should make the operation of the pipelines a key concern. You should make sure you have the sorts of things you would for any enduring service. So you're able to monitor the data pipelines, know what normal flow looks like, and have clear alerts when there are errors and deviations from that normal flow. And make sure that you have tools in place when it does go wrong. So things like being able to support backfilling for cases when the pipeline fails. We work with clients who have come to us after they've successfully created data stores and dashboards that initially are really well received, and they become a really important source for the business owners to make decisions. But then problems start to occur in the pipeline which go undetected. Suddenly, important key business metrics make unexpected changes, and the business users lose trust in the pipeline. People then start creating their own ad hoc pipelines, and instead of a single view of the truth, the business has multiple versions of what's going on. So it can be quite difficult to recover from this loss of trust. The temptation is sometimes to blame the tech stack and decide the whole thing needs replacing, but that might not be the reason. It may well be that the core pipeline tech is not the problem, but that the lack of monitoring, the lack of observability, as we call it, is what's causing you problems. So all of these things with data pipelines to kind of avoid the sorts of problems happening. I think probably all of us here on the call, we all have a part to play to stop these sorts of things happening. So if you're a delivery lead or a Scrum Master type, then make sure you create space in the backlog to include tasks for the operability concerns. Technical teams, strive to include these practices and the other ones I'm going to talk about later on in your work. Don't let things like monitoring and alerting get pushed to the bottom of the backlog. And product owners, recognize that quality, usability, and operability are really important, and they can make or break a successful pipeline and should be considered at least as valuable as something like adding a new data source. Although it can feel like the new data source is a more pressing need, but these things are really important as well. If you lose that trust, it's quite hard to bring it back again. Okay, next principle. So I spoke earlier about how many of the challenges that you have with data are around the ability of the data users to work with it. So what can we do to make sure that our data users can get the data they need in a way that makes sense for them? So we like to take a leaf out of the Agile Playbook and create our pipelines with a use case or use cases in mind. You should know who and what sorts of people will be using the data and what they want to use it for. And you should consult with those users as you build it out. So, make sure they can access the data in a way that works for them. Make sure that you create the roles to meet the needs of the user and give them the right access rights. It may sound strange that I have to mention this. It might seem obvious to some of you, but we are asked surprisingly often to put data pipelines in place without bothering the end users. This makes it much less likely that the pipeline will be a valued product. The data users may well be very busy, which I think is the reason why we're often asked not to bother them, but they usually welcome the opportunity to shape a tool which will be of great benefit to them. Data science types, for example, are often people with strong mathematical backgrounds, and they may well expect the data to be delivered in a format similar to a spreadsheet, something that looks like a CSV file. That's their preferred way of accessing data. And what I'm about to say may shock some people here, so please get ready to clutch your pearls. But they will not have, or they may not have the data wrangling skills such as SQL manipulation that you might imagine. So if you expect this, it can be easy to resolve. So you can do something like just provide them with some denormalized views, with perhaps a little bit of basic coaching as to how you might access the database. But if you don't, it can lead to misunderstanding between your data engineers and the users, and the refusal to use those pipelines, which would be a terrible shame after all the work you put in. Building around use cases and consulting the users makes it much less likely that you'll build a system they cannot access in the right way, or that they are unable to use the data in the way they want. And at the same time, you'll probably get great insights into why data sources can become untrusted. So you're more likely to make better quality pipes with the right error checking, validation, transformations. What else can you do to accelerate giving your data users what they need in a way they can trust it? Well, data collected for a given problem or a piece of analysis will nearly always be useful in answering other questions. So try to find ways of making common use of the data. Reuse it where you can, and make it pragmatically open to reuse by others. But do remember to keep your use case in mind. Don't try to make it usable for everyone and anyone, but do try to architect for reuse whilst keeping lean. For example, there are usually a variety of places where data is stored in the pipeline. So raw ingested data or intermediate tables might very well be useful for unanticipated purposes, and can often be made available to the power users if they're given access. Role-based access technologies can enable this while still permitting the strict adherence to data protection policies and regulations. In general, keeping the raw data is a good practice. In most cases, storage is cheap, and keeping the raw stuff will help you reuse for new use cases. So this is one of the main insights behind data lakes. The missing part being that just keeping the data still does not bridge the gap between the raw data and the users. You still got to create that part of the pipe. A data pipeline is a complex mixture of software, infrastructure, and data sources. And we want to be able to amend our data pipelines in an agile fashion as the data environment and the needs of the business change. So just like any other piece of working software, we should adopt continuous delivery practices to enable continuous updates of the pipelines in production. Continuous delivery is really important to EE. If you're here, you probably know that, and it's very much part of our DNA. So I'm not going to bang on too much about the need for continuous integration, deployment, configuration control, and so on. I just want to raise some specific points that are particularly relevant for data pipelines. You start with cloud, so make the most of what cloud can offer. All the cloud vendors have great technologies for storing and transporting data. Of course, you should configuration manage the infrastructure using infrastructure as code tools like Terraform or CloudFormation or whatever your tool of choice is. Continuously test. As with any continuous delivery development, the data pipeline needs to be tested. This can be more challenging than with application development. Dependencies, and there are usually some really big and important dependencies, They're often difficult to mock out, and the volumes of some of the data sources may make it impossible to exhaustively test. I'm sure we've all experienced those things. So you do need to be pragmatic, and you may need to have some tests in a production environment, and that can feel uncomfortable for some continuous delivery practitioners. This is particularly true where you're handling personal information, which must be kept in prod, and you still need to kind of test against. Do make use of orchestration tools. They enable you to separate out the specific transformations from the running and monitoring the pipeline. And we recommend selecting one if you can. So ones like Airflow, Dagster, Argo Workflows, there's lots of them. If you want to know more about this, I really recommend you read the recent blog by our very own Claudia Diniz and Tiago Agostinho about selecting and using DBT as their orchestration tool. DBT is for SQL-based pipelines. So if you've got the right structured data, using the database as the main compute engine is like a really neat way of simplifying the required infrastructure. And if you go to this link here, there's some really interesting stuff. That's some sort of detailed explanation of how and why they use DBT. How do we make sure we get to the data to the users in the right timeframes? So we need to recognize that pipelines operate at understood frequencies and volumes. So they have a cadence that is driven by the need for decision making. So what's your decision making timeframe you need to have stuff done by? But it's limited by the availability of the source data. So the developers and the users of a pipeline should understand and recognize this as a well-defined unit of work, whether it's every few seconds, whether it's hourly, daily, monthly, or event-driven. When you're constructing the pipelines, you need to build for this latency. If you need to be within real time or near real time, then this needs to be a key factor at each step of the pipe, because the speed of the pipe will be conditioned by the speed of the slowest stage. But remember that the speed of your pipe is limited to the speed of your input sources. So if all your data sources are produced by daily batch jobs, then the best latency you can reach will be daily updates. And the extra cost of real-time implementations will not provide any real business benefits. Whilst we do, just a note on this really, whilst we do work with many clients that have real-time needs, in our experience, that many businesses don't struggle necessarily with very big data or real-time data needs. Often the challenge is that the data is complex. So there's lots of different but valuable sources in different formats, with different data models that need to be brought together. I want to go back to one of the things I mentioned earlier, which is that pipelines are a complex mix of code and infrastructure. And you can quickly start to have problems constructing, maintaining, and using their outputs if you don't have a consistent approach to naming. Pipelines will include at least a set of databases, whether it's SQL or NoSQL, tables, attributes, buckets, roles, and so on and so forth, lambdas, cloud functions, all sorts of things. And they should be named in a consistent way to make it easy to maintain, to understand and maintain the pipelines. But not just the code. Having a shared understanding of your domain is also really important. So data models are important. For the data to be valuable to the end users, so the BI teams or the data scientists, remember them from the slide in the beginning, it has to be understandable at the point of use. In addition, a lot of their analytics will almost always require the ability to merge data from sources. And so you need to have a shared understanding of the data entities in the fields, and you probably need some kind of data model to resolve to. If you ignore this data model at the start of the pipeline, you're going to end up having to address these needs later on. And you can end up in a situation where the end users have to construct their own data model. If this happens, they'll be much less inclined to use your shiny new pipeline. However, we do not recommend the development of a large enterprise-wide data model before data can be ingested into your system. That way, you may well start, but you probably never finish. Instead, as Agile, we recommend you start with the needs of that initial data users in the initial use case, create a data model to meet that, and iterate and develop that over time. And the same goes really as well for master data. So related to the data model, you're going to have a whole bunch of data related to reference data, master data, things like organizational units, product lists, currencies, people, companies, all those sorts of things. Again, you don't want to fall prey to analysis paralysis. You don't have to do master data for the whole organization. Pick the ones that's required for your use case and iterate around that, and you'll kind of grow your kind of master data that way. Okay, so that's the principles. You'll be pleased to hear. I just want to talk about one final pitfall that can happen when you have really successful pipelines. So you avoided all the pitfalls, you followed our principles, well done, fantastic, and now you've got a great set of pipelines, and it's providing data to the BI and the data science teams that you can see here. So this is all working well. These guys are getting fantastic data. They're really happy. And using these pipelines, your data scientists, these guys here, find some great ways of improving the business. Maybe they've created a risk detection model or something like that. And you decide to deploy those algorithms into the operational systems down here. The question is, what data do you use to drive these algorithms and these services here? It's tempting to use this data here. After all, it's trusted, you know what it is, and you know how it works. But do be careful doing that, because you can easily end up preventing the extraction of insights that the pipeline and this whole kind of warehouse and data environment was originally implemented for. The data warehouses can become so integrated into these operations here that they effectively act as an operational data store, and they can no longer function as a data warehouse. So because these key business activities are dependent on the fast processing of data coming through here, it prevents the users here running their queries or doing kind of the ad hoc analyses they need to do. So what can you do to prevent this? The assumption here is that it's a microservice architecture. I think that's how most people do their kind of architectures these days. One of the tenets of microservices is that they own their own data. And we do heartily endorse this. And so ideally, any new service, any new algorithm that's being used by these people here should have its own route to the data. If you do need to draw data from parts here, so you might draw some from here, or perhaps from some intermediate tables here, take care deciding which part you draw your data from. So the nearer the data is from here, to the end part where the data users are using it, the more constrained your analytics pipelines will become over time, and the more restricted analytics users will become in what they do. So if a microservice is drawing directly from here, it's probably time to reproduce the pipeline itself as its own microservice. As over time, the needs of these guys here and the needs of the service here are going to diverge, and so it's going to make it hard to meet both users effectively. I want to finish by raising a quick question. Is a data pipeline actually a platform? So I think all organizations would benefit from a place where they can collect and analyze data from different parts of the business. And historically, this has often been met by a data platform, so a centralized data store where useful data is collected and made available to approved people. However, following a single platform pattern often leads to a central data engineering team tasked with implementing the data flows. The complexities of meeting everyone's needs and ensuring appropriate information governance leads to a lack of self-service and often makes it hard to ingest new data sources, which leads to backlog buildup, frustrated data users, and overworked data engineers. We think that thinking of data flows as pipelines changes the mindset away from those kind of monolithic solutions to a more decentralized way of thinking. So understand what pipes and data stores you need and implement them the right way for that use case, whilst reusing where appropriate. One of the practices that we use when starting in a greenfield site is to start with what we call a steel thread. So it's a first thin slice through, which leads to a point of value, like maybe a dashboard or a useful data set for the data science team. As we continue, we add more threads to that. So it might be additional data sources, it might be additional security roles, it might be more transformations. After several iterations, you have a rich set of data flows. Is that a platform? Is it a data mesh? Is it a data fabric? I don't have an opinion on that. I'm going to leave that open for discussion. And that's me. Thank you very much for listening. As I said earlier, this has been based on our Data Pipeline Playbook. Anyone can access from our website. Please give us any feedback you have. Our playbooks are always being iterated, improved. So now I'm going to hand over to Erin and our panel.
Thanks, Simon. I've just been thinking back on all sorts of previous projects where some of this insight would have been useful. Thanks for putting the URL up there for the playbook. Someone asked us about the blog post that you mentioned, and I think I found the right URL for it. So I put that in the chat, but we can post it into the Q&A as well. I wanted to just give the panelists a chance to maybe say a little bit about how they might be using some of the principles from the playbook in their organizations, and that might generate some questions from the attendees as well. So who would like to start? Should I go alphabetically with Arron?
Yeah, so we, I think there's actually a quote from some of the work we've done in the playbook around data analysis and use cases and understanding what the data is for and doing that analysis really quickly. So we had to, we went from having nothing really to having a fully working MI system for the census in around 6 months or so. So it was a really quick turnaround that included not only internal systems, but over 20 suppliers. So we had to be really targeted on what we were using the data for, how we were getting it, and specifically the frequency and use of that data. So we, and I will come to some of the questions, but I know one of the questions in the it's already been asked is around whether transactional or real-time data are intermixed, and we had that conversation a lot during our inception phase and during our early development. So yeah, I think that's the main areas where we've contributed and followed some of the principles in the playbook.
Yeah, and I think the based on what you said, there's probably going to be some more questions coming, given how much data you probably were taking in for the census.
So in about 3 months, we took about 2.5 billion rows of data. So
amazing. John, do you want to have a go about what's happening at AO?
Yeah, certainly. So we're still relatively early in our journey, really, with some of the concepts that we've been speaking about in this particular talk today. And I think, you know, we're really looking at how do we take data forward at AO. And I think a lot of the pitfalls that have been spoke about, you know, I think they're known industry-wide to a certain degree. And I think, you know, just looking at the ways that we can find ways to solve those challenges, particularly, you know, thinking around ownership of data quality. I've seen a couple of questions come through already, which will be interesting to talk through. And I was actually struck by that piece you talked through, Simon, on you know, avoiding tight coupling between what's operational and analytical data. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation around that for ourselves there as well, particularly, and I think that's a big challenge that a lot of places will be tackling over the years to come.
Thanks. I'm going to overtake you, Lewis, for a second. Go to Nadia first from Wayfair.
Hi, my name is Nadia. I work on the supply side of Wayfair. Whilst Wayfair has many customers, we only have about 15,000 suppliers. So our data volumes on the end of Wayfair where I work are not quite as large as many people would imagine. However, as opposed to most of the data engineers that work on the customer side at Wayfair, we have not only users in data science and analytics, but also the suppliers are our users, and they tend to have very different requirements. So I hear many people say real-time data is overrated, and most people don't really need it. And whilst I quite agree with that, in our case for the supplier, I have to kind of side with them. It is somewhat essential for the suppliers to know when a customer has placed an order, and knowing within a couple of seconds is definitely more useful than knowing at the end of the day, since the fulfillment of the orders just goes significantly faster. And as such, whilst I can connect to every single one of the pitfalls, Simon, that you described there, I mean, these are my daily friends at work. I think the one principle that is most certainly a bit about trust. Yeah, definitely. Our suppliers have some issues after the many years of us building pipelines. The one that rings most true for me on the principle side is to stick to the users and the requirements that they have. This really helps us. We always go back to when we try to be pragmatic about decisions and try to merge the needs of individual pipelines, try not to be too wasteful with our resources. We remind ourselves it's in the end the data user, may that be a scientist or an analyst or even an engineer or the supplier. And then, yeah, not trying to couple things too tightly. So we're very concerned about the single source of truth, which is definitely a thing when you have 17,000 employees who are all over the place with databases. We're very democratic at Wayfair. Everyone can copy a table and build a pipeline. So we're very concerned about a single source of truth, but at the same time also very aware that if we try to have this tightly coupled, very centralized thing where everything exists only once, it just becomes too complicated and too error prone. You can't meet the demands anymore for all the many different types of stakeholders and the requirements.
Thank you. Lewis, you're with Equal Experts, and you've probably worked with data pipelines and quite a few clients. I think you've done some government work. Do you want to mention anything that struck you in the presentation or the playbook?
Yeah, certainly. So I think I can openly say my client at the moment is HMRC, Data Platform Services. So I basically build out platforms for the advanced analytics and I guess cognitive areas. So mostly data scientists are consuming it in SAS, R, and Python. I think that a couple of things that strike a chord immediately are the engineering aspect of it, the repeatability, the treating it as a product and just like overlaying good engineering practices, basically. So we have I guess most organizations are moving to the cloud, and being able to take that idea of infrastructure as code is increasingly important for being able to build reliable pipelines and things. Another area that I just want to pick up on as well is like the value of data over time. It's a really sort of, I think, an interesting idea is that data loses value quite quickly, but it's a U-shaped graph, because while immediately, it's quite a big sort of tail off in terms of how useful that data is, it begins to get value again over time, and certainly in aggregation. So maybe yesterday's stock prices or whatever aren't that useful in comparison to stock prices a minute ago, but last year's stock prices are incredibly important for trending and then applying various analytical techniques and things. So it's just, yeah, an interesting point. And the final one, I guess, which sticks in my mind is the idea of building pipelines for a specific use case, but then always having a mind as to how they can be reused by further users and things. So we've got a number of really good examples of that, where we've built pipelines which ultimately are centered around documents. HMRC deals with an awful lot of documents, and trying to apply structure to that, trying to extract out useful information, building full text indexing search engines and things, but then ultimately having that data available again in its close to raw form for the data scientists to play with that scale is a really useful and very, I guess, like a source of a lot of really interesting projects we're doing at the moment.
Cool, thank you. So should we go to the questions? There's some popular ones at the top here that a few of you might be able to comment on. So the first one is someone called Danny has said, how do you orchestrate all the parts of the pipeline in a way you can reuse some of the parts in different pipelines? And I'm looking for someone coming off of mute in the panel. Arron.
I'll start. Hopefully someone will join me. So I think it's, and again, it relates to a different question that we've got here, probably around ELT and ETL. It depends, and all use cases are different, but in our particular use case, we were very lucky in that we managed to harness cloud technology and the power of the cloud So we very much use the EOT model rather than ETL model. So we didn't necessarily transform the data on the way in. We did validation and parsing, but we then held the data in a lake, and so then it's available. And then we joined up many pipelines. So as I said, we had over 20 supplier pipelines coming in with MI data every day, and we were able to join different pipelines together because we were just using the base data from the lake rather than actually being constrained by the transformation and that we'd done on the way in.
That's a good answer. Did you want to say something, Simon?
Yeah, no, I was just saying it's a really good question. Arron's got, I thought it was we've talked about this before, is a great example of reuse, and it's quite a common one. So that principle of raw data, you bring it in, and then you open up the opportunities for being able to reuse it later, which is what you want to do. Because often there's a fair amount of effort bringing it in, and then there's lots of different ways you can use it. I think one of the things about reuse, of course, is it's things like kind of security domains and stuff like that. Who's allowed to use that data, who's not allowed to use that data. Sometimes that's a problem, and sometimes it isn't. Right? If there's no PII, you're probably all right within the organisation to use it all. But that's something I think to bear in mind, and I don't have an answer for that right now. It all depends on the context. But the orchestration, I suppose, is, to me, it's all about that kind of that steel thread. You have a domain effectively of a pipeline of things coming in and then coming out to the users, onto the different users, and building up over that steel thread. Then you can build, you build in the right kind of security context and all that kind of stuff for the different kinds of users, and you can manage it that way. And I suppose that is that thing of a kind of almost like an emerging data platform. I'm very wary of the term platform because it's, if you've ever been a data user, you're quite often, it doesn't quite meet your needs, and it's quite frustrating. But that kind of emerging of things, is I think usually our steel thread will be under the control of a single means of orchestration, effectively. So I think that's how it pans out in practice for us.
Did you want to chime in, Nadia, on that one?
Yeah, so most of the data that we feed to our suppliers at Wayfair, it just necessarily has to cross many data domains. So we have the Wayfair data divided into large, really almost paradigms in a sense, large domains like, say, customer, supplier, order, and product, very high level. So very frequently a data pipeline literally needs to cross some of these, and we use some, call them, like, I don't know, sense-making vehicles or certain architectural structures that we use. We kind of divide data in foundational layers and curated layers, and then we make these available to each other, almost like services. There can be pipelines that need to cross in and out of a foundational and then into a curated data layer in order to end up somewhere else. And as a result of this, actually, a lot of the components of pipelines are being reused. If you wish, we have very rarely the luxury to just build a single pipeline for something that is just for the use. It primarily really happens in situations where the data is real time. So if you really only have 60 seconds to move something from A to B, there's very little chance that somebody will tap into it or take it out of it. Yeah, so that's what helps us to be better at sharing.
We've got lots of questions coming in. The next one is probably maybe somewhat related because it's covering quality. So how do you deal with data quality where it may be good enough in the source system, but not complete enough when trying to combine it with other data sources for customer dashboards, for example, comparing addresses when the town is missing?
I don't mind starting with this one. Yeah, I think the bits that spring to mind for me was talking through that data pipeline as a product aspect, and really bringing that product mindset to the data itself. If you think about good characteristics of a product and the quality that comes around with it, is it meeting the needs of our consumers, which are our customers in that sense. So starting to think, apply products thinking to your data, apply product thinking to your data pipelines, I think is a good place to start with that from my perspective.
Thanks, John. Go ahead, Arron.
So I think it's about inputs and outputs as well. We talked about this as products, and as products we have outputs. And so for in this particular instance, while that data might not be available from the supplier in a good enough system, there's no reason you can't supplement it and build base tables. So it's a really good example of, we don't know the town, but we might know the address or the postcode. So if we have a base postcode reference, we can then reference that back. And again, it's trying to do where you do the transformation, but I think base data sets and additional data sets, and understanding that is really key in this.
Lewis?
I was just going to say, as part of the data pipeline as well, it's quite common to enrich the data. So you don't necessarily change the data that's in flight as part of your pipeline, but certainly doing address lookups and sort of standardizing on like your own internal, whatever kind of like a unique address systems you've got, adding UPRNs if you've got that kind of capability and things. I know we do a lot of work of taking addresses and putting it into consistent formats, but we always keep the original as well, as part of that data pipeline. But that it's not just addresses, it could be all kinds of other elements where you can enrich that data as part of the pipeline.
Thank you. Shall I move on to another? So next question is Richard asking about the arrival of DBT, the data build tool. I think this is the tool you mentioned, Simon, that was in this blog. So the arrival of DBT encourages analysts and data scientists to own SQL-based transformations, pipelines traditionally implemented by data engineers and BI developers. How may this impact traditional ways of working, and what may be required to implement it successfully?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take this one first. It's really interesting. I think it's really interesting. There's lots of different ways you can create pipelines, aren't there? You can go through a Spark type route. You can have a sort of Python type route. You can have a SQL based route, and that's what DBT's done. And I think that what's happened is you now have these kind of big kind of cloud native databases like Snowflake or BigQuery or things like that, and they've got so much compute power in them, kind of hidden away, that you can actually you can do the whole thing in SQL. You can do a lot of your transformation, all your transformations effectively in SQL in a way that works really well if SQL is the way you like to do stuff. And for a lot of people, that's right. So it does save a lot of effort and putting up of infrastructure and stuff, because suddenly your infrastructure is much simpler. Of course, that works if your pipeline is very SQL based in the first instance, and you don't need to do other stuff, like maybe there's some lookups that are particularly strange, require particular kind of functions to do that, or maybe you need to impute values or other things, so it doesn't work for everything. But if it does work, it's a really neat way, I think, of putting those pipelines in a place that is easier for the end users to understand. And I think that leads me on to another point that I haven't put in my principles, but I think is important. So when we think about the data users, when we are asked to do data pipelines, there's a number of things you have to take into account. We've spoken about the latency and the volume and all those kind of things. But the other one is, maintenance of it by the people who use it. If you can find a way to make it easily maintainable by the people who are going to use it afterwards, then that's great, isn't it? Because suddenly they're able to look after their pipeline. There's more of an element of self-service there. And like I say, sometimes. So we've done stuff like that with SQL, because the people there are very kind of DBA, database focused, so it's easy for them to maintain. But we've also done it with these kind of like more Python pipelines, basically, because in that instance the data scientists were very Python focused, and that was a great way for them to be able to maintain the pipeline. So I went on a bit of there, but that's a really interesting question.
I would just add to that, Arron, that I work in an organisation that has some of the best statistical minds in the country, and this was really powerful for us. So we were absolutely, in some respects, we were able to give them the whole sandpit to play in rather than one corner and say, this is, and we've all got key business KPIs and other data that we absolutely need on a regular basis. But when you've got these really clever people, you know, who live and breathe the data every day, why would you not give them access to as much as possible, and run hackathons and other, you know, other really good tools to see what you can get out of that? Because the benefits of that can be things that you've never even thought of or never even known you needed, and then you come to rely on them on a day-to-day basis.
That's a great takeaway. That leads into the next question, I think, because we were talking about changes in ways of working. And the next question is, how do you manage change in large companies and organizations to service the necessity of rapid iteration that both serving real user needs and continuous delivery? I hope I read that right. So how do you manage the change to service the rapid iteration? Did that happen to anyone in your organizations, or have you seen that in clients, Simon?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, every organization I've worked in has that challenge of being able to iterate rapidly, right? I mean, there's always, like I said, the data environment is always dynamic. Things are always changing. There's always a demand for new data sources, for new metrics and stuff like that. So it's pretty fundamental, I think, for everywhere. I mean, for me, the whole focus on the continuous delivery is because that allows you to iterate rapidly, right? That's why it's in place, right? I mean, I know it might take a little bit more time up front to get the various kind of mechanisms in place, but not a huge amount. And there's loads of great tools out there. But once you have that in place, you can iterate rapidly. You can do stuff. You can try stuff out. You can go back if it doesn't work, and you're able to kind of really meet kind of user demands much more quickly. So I see them kind of as working together. Really, that's my take on it.
So I was just going to step in there, following up from the previous discussion. You were talking about having the end users, the analysts, etc., data scientists empowered. Something we're seeing a lot of at the moment, and I don't say we have a complete solution to it, is data scientists actually being part of a data pipeline, in that they're not necessarily just producing visualizations or written report of insights and things. They're actually an active part of the pipeline, whereby they're aggregating different and disparate data sets together and then moving those on to further use cases and things. And we're constantly dealing with this problem about developing in production, essentially. And HMRC being a very, well, not just regulated, but conservative environment in terms of change controls and all that kind of thing, and then having data scientists with new toolkits suddenly just landing right on top of incredibly sensitive data. I mean, I can mention a couple of examples, such as a lot of the COVID-19 systems that have been put out there. You need eligibility criteria up front, and the data scientists are actually pulling that from all kinds of disparate parts of HMRC and building out a data set which then gets sent onto the digital services and is used interactively and things.
I think I talked about in the last question, I think, Lewis, around moving, allowing data scientists to have at it almost, but it's moving the decisions to where the information is, right? So, as senior managers, we all think that we know what we want, but at the end of an 8-hour day, where you're in your 15th meeting and you don't have all that information, and trusting people and allowing people to be able to make those decisions is a really big part of it. And it's a long road to get there, especially if you come from a waterfall environment rather than agile environment. But you need to be steering people down that route, in my experience.
I wonder about the retail organizations, and when you're either in a business peak or preparing for a business peak, or looking back at the last year's peak of data. I mean, I wonder if there's anything there you wanted to comment on in terms of change and iterating.
Yeah, I was holding back a little bit because I was wondering, is this a question where somebody should just explain agile kind of, but at the same time, I want to help and I want to make sure all the questions get answered. then I don't necessarily really know to which extent data engineering teams and organizations exist, and what how people work and what kind of skills that they have. So on our end, the data engineering teams, they're just regular agile development teams. So they will spend not more than 1 or 2 sprints before they deliver output. And we most certainly have exciting things like Way Day, which is just something very recent. I don't know, maybe Arron, you did buy something in this massive sale where there will be 2 or 3 days where we sell more than in an entire year. And that's really, I mean, everyone in the organization spends weeks and weeks to build up to this. And there isn't a single person that isn't going to go and, you know, spin up more servers and do this and that, and switch off pipelines elsewhere where data is just not allowed to go through for a certain time. Yeah, but definitely kind of, I've worked so long in startups. For me, there isn't really anything other than agile anymore. I have to admit, not meaning to come across as high and mighty. All these principles are really, you know, they're really very much worthwhile adopting, and they're definitely very helpful. We are not always super fast because particularly when you build up complex pipelines, there's a huge amount of load testing also that has to be done. And if you need to backfill years worth of data somewhere, that just really actually does take time. And if anyone knows how to do this faster, I'm really happy to hear advice and input. There's a couple of things that I haven't been able to crack myself.
Perhaps we'll have some advice for you on our after expert talk chat. Jon, did you have something up from AO on that?
Yeah, I was just going to touch on something Lewis mentioned on just on his introduction, which was around that value of data over time as well. I think there's a distinction between, you know, creating almost actionable insights at the point that things are happening. You know, so you're taking what you learned in the past and applying that, you know, in the domains that are applicable. That has got real ownership. It's kind of in the day to day. And then, you know, what we spoke about a lot in this is, you know, people like the analysts getting access to that data after the fact. They might find the patterns that will inform what happens in the next peak period, or data scientists finding, you know, behaviors for customer behavior through that data that might inform new opportunities for the business to take down in the future as well. And I think there is a distinction between the two a little bit, you know, between you know, that domain ownership almost as the data's happening, how we do things as it's happening, and then how we can kind of inform strategy almost for the organization for what's happened in the past in preparation for big events. You know, I definitely resonated with what Nadia said. It's Black Friday for us, but it's definitely a big event of the year that you know, the whole organization is kind of moving towards, really.
I'm working for a retail client right now too, so that's why I was thinking in that realm.
I would just add to what Jon and Nadia said, really, is don't be afraid to fail fast, but try things, absolutely, you know, be as agile as possible.
Yeah, definitely, I agree with that.
Are we ready to talk about GDPR? So Rob has asked a question saying, how do you deal with both known and possibly unexpected personal information that might appear in your data inputs? Do you have any strategies for managing this, particularly around the right to deletion with respect to GDPR?
Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously GDPR, PII is a big topic in its own, isn't it? You know, it's something that, you know, if you are dealing with it, again, it's almost like the kind of the you know, the real time question. If you are dealing with it, know it up front, right? Because you're going to have something in place to manage it. But there's plenty of things you can do. You know, if you are cloud, right? You know, you can have all the kind of role-based access control. You can put that in place. You can make sure that's applied in the right way. Of course, you've got to be careful that, you know, the data coming in is going to, you know, is in the if it goes into a table, that you've got the right columns hidden, you know, or you've got the right access to the columns. It might be column level, might be row level, who knows? But the tools are there to do it, I think. I can't say there's a you know, there's a button you can press to resolve it that I'm aware of. But there are, like I say, you know, if you're in that cloud environment, I think the tools are there to certainly resolve it if you're up front. If you get the other question, I think there is about, you know, what do you do when it unexpectedly appears? you know, get rid of it, obviously. Find a way of getting rid of it, but it depends, doesn't it? You know, you can't there are tools out there that will detect it. There's some really good tools for scrubbing PII, if you need to, if that's really important. And then, you know, you have to do whatever's in the right thing in your particular pipeline to scrub it from the various stages. No, I'd love to give you, Rob, I'd love to say here's a button you can press and this is the strategy, but I'm not aware of it. If anyone on the panel is, let me know, please.
I definitely don't have an answer, but this kind of reminds me a little bit. I like to think of like data on the inside and data on the outside, where, you know, data on the inside is the stuff that's happening within your operational systems, and then the data on the outside is the stuff that you're purposefully sharing. And if you're proactive and, you know, quite intentional with how you're sharing that data, then that ownership, again, I think I've mentioned it a couple of times, means that you should be able to manage that before it gets to a point that it's ending up in your downstream systems. Now, that's not to say it'll never happen. Of course, it might do. But I guess, you know, treating your data as a product, having that right ownership in place, purposeful sharing your data on the outside is probably a few things that'd be on my mind for that conversation.
I would just add to that, I think, get expert advice around GDPR. Make sure you absolutely understand what you're dealing with and what the rules are around it, because it's very complex, but not always as scary as you think it's going to be.
Good advice. And I've totally lost track of time. We're like pretty much out of time. We just got so involved in the answers here. Sorry. There are more questions here. I mean, I can squeeze one more in if we think we can do it quickly. I'm going to go with this question here. What percentage of data consumed for dashboards or reports can be termed as optimized use with minimal waste from a 100% of ingested data? I'm not sure what those words mean together, but I'm hoping one of you does. So they're looking for a percentage. Who's got an answer?
Well, again, I don't have a percentage. I mean, you know, what's valuable, right? So Lewis had some, I thought, really insightful stuff to say earlier about data and about how it, you know, it can be valued in a certain time frame and then it loses value and can get value, but also an awful lot of data isn't valuable. You know, it's worth bearing that in mind, and you know, some things just aren't interesting, and I don't think that's really for me, that's not the focus I like to put on stuff. You know, if you're looking at dashboards and reports, what's valuable is what's the business action, decision, whatever it is, it's going to change. How is it actionable? What's the thing that matters? And so if you take in 1,000 data points and only 2 of them are the ones that make the difference, or you take in, you know, 1,000 fields and actually only 2 of those ones are actionable, it doesn't really matter, does it? You know, the point is you've found the 2 that make a business difference. And I don't think you know what are going to make the real business difference until you've tried them, right? You just don't know how the business is going to respond to stuff. And that, you know, iterative building stuff, you know, as Nadia was saying earlier, you know, that agile thing is that's fundamental with data, because the value of data is difficult to understand until you've tried it out. But you can fail fast, you know, as we were talking about earlier.
Having been an analyst for a long time, the longest time before I became a data engineer, I believe if the question really just is about what ends up in a dashboard, how useful or valuable is it, if there had to be percentages, I have a cynical view to offer on this, having spent many years placing product analysts and engineering teams and together with product managers. There's this perfect, very famous quote. I can't remember from whom it is. It says, people use data like a drunk person uses a lamppost, more for support rather than illumination. I think that is something, the cynic in me, this very much rings true with me for a lot of the cases. Data is very important to be used across the organization, because it reminds us that we need to make a balance between our intuitions and our feelings, and it kind of keeps us a little bit honest. And how valuable you believe that is, that's up for you to decide. The greatest value, I do believe, in data can be harnessed by computers. So, you know, if you want value, then invest in machine learning and artificial intelligence, because computers will definitely take value out of it. Having said this, I have large teams of product analysts that build many dashboards. We're big invested in Looker and Data Studio. Transparency is a very important thing in organizations. People need to have access to data and to be able to work with the data, get the dashboards. And that in itself, if you're not too judgmental, that in itself is valuable, I believe. Great
answer. Thank you. And great image you've left in my mind of a drunk person standing next to a lamppost. So this is some information on our next talk. It's the 30th of June. It's about remote working and improving teams' performance and having how aggregated gains can result in high performance. I hope you'll join us for that. The link is there also on the website. We have all the recordings of all our previous talks there. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Simon. Have a great rest of your evening. See you soon.